They thought denying her seat was just policy, but they had no idea who she really was. Emily Carter stepped into first class in worn sneakers and a simple sweater, her ticket scanned, her eyes calm. The flight attendant's smile tightened. "Ma'am, economy is that way." Emily quietly showed her boarding pass. A pause, then a soft laugh. "This section is for premium passengers." Heads turned. Whispers spread. The cabin air shifted as the attendant called a supervisor, voice louder now. "We need to verify eligibility." The humiliation landed hard. Emily didn't argue. She just touched her wedding ring. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Is there a problem here?" The attendant turned and froze. Because the man standing behind her wasn't just a passenger. They thought denying her seat was just policy, just another routine moment in a long shift. But they had no idea they were about to humiliate the wrong woman. The first-class cabin glowed under soft amber lighting, polished surfaces reflecting quiet luxury, leather seats arranged like thrones for those who belonged. And as passengers settled in with tailored suits and designer luggage, Emily Carter stepped in wearing a simple cream sweater, faded blue jeans, and a pair of worn white sneakers that whispered a different story. She moved calmly, her posture straight, her eyes steady, carrying nothing but a modest carry-on and a quiet confidence that didn't ask for attention, yet somehow held it. A few heads turned, subtle glances exchanged, the kind that lingered just a second too long, measuring, judging, deciding. Then came the smile, tight, practiced, and just a little too sharp. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said, stepping into her path with a voice wrapped in politeness but edged with something colder. "Economy is that way." The words landed lightly, but the meaning behind them echoed louder than any announcement over the intercom. Emily paused, her expression unchanged, and gently handed over her boarding pass. For a brief second, there was silence as the attendant scanned it, eyes flicking across the screen, then back at Emily, then down again as if searching for a mistake that wasn't there. A faint chuckle slipped out, controlled, almost rehearsed. "This section is reserved for premium passengers," she added, slightly louder now, just enough for nearby travelers to hear. The cabin shifted. Conversation slowed. Eyes lifted. The air grew thinner, heavier with unspoken tension. Emily didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply said, "That is my seat." Her tone was calm, measured, but it only seemed to irritate the attendant more. "I'm going to need to verify this," she replied, signaling to a colleague, her voice carrying just enough authority to turn curiosity into spectacle. A supervisor was called. The word eligibility was mentioned, not once, but twice, each time louder, sharper, cutting through the cabin like a quiet accusation. The room, no, the cabin, went silent. People leaned back slightly, pretending not to watch while watching everything. A man in a navy suit raised an eyebrow. A woman across the aisle exchanged a glance with her companion. And still, Emily stood there, unmoving, her fingers brushing lightly against the simple gold band on her left hand. No diamonds. No statement. Just a ring. Her breathing remained even, her gaze steady, as if she had seen this moment before, as if she already knew how it would end. The attendant straightened her posture, emboldened by the attention, her voice now firm, almost performative. "Ma'am, if you can't provide proper confirmation, I'll have to ask you to step aside." Step aside. Two words that echoed far beyond the aisle. And then, just as the silence stretched to its breaking point, a voice came from behind, low, calm, and unmistakably powerful. "Is there a problem here?" The kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to command attention. The kind that made people turn before they even realized they were doing it. The attendant's expression shifted as she turned, her confidence faltering for the first time. Because the man standing there wasn't just another passenger. And in that single moment, everything in the room began to change. The moment the man stepped forward, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted in a way that no announcement could explain, as if the air itself recognized something the others had not yet understood. He was not loud, not aggressive, but there was a weight to his presence, a quiet authority that made even the most confident passengers straighten slightly in their seats. The flight attendant, Olivia Hayes, turned fully now, her rehearsed smile returning out of habit, though it no longer held the same certainty. "Sir, I am handling a seating discrepancy," she said, her tone controlled but noticeably tighter than before. The man's eyes moved past her, not even acknowledging the explanation, settling instead on Emily. For a brief second, something softened in his expression, something personal, something that did not belong to this public moment. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Emily gave the smallest nod, her composure unchanged, but her fingers still resting lightly against her ring. That was all he needed. When his gaze returned to Olivia, it was no longer soft. It was precise, measured, the kind of look that did not demand respect, but expected it. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked again, slower this time. Olivia straightened, instinctively shifting into a more formal posture. "This passenger is attempting to occupy a first-class seat without proper verification," she replied, her voice carefully neutral, though a faint edge of defensiveness crept in. A murmur rippled quietly through the nearby rows. The word attempting lingered in the air like an accusation. The man glanced briefly at the boarding pass still in Emily's hand, then back at Olivia. "She already presented her ticket," he said. It was not a question. Olivia hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "We are simply ensuring that all guests meet the eligibility standards for this cabin," she added, choosing her words with deliberate care now. Eligibility. The word echoed again, but this time it sounded smaller, weaker, as if it had lost some of its power. The man took a slow step forward, closing the distance just enough to change the dynamic of the entire interaction. "And what exactly determines eligibility?" he asked. There was no hostility in his tone, but there was something far more unsettling. Expectation. Olivia opened her mouth, then paused. Around them, the silence deepened. Even the distant hum of the aircraft seemed to fade. A passenger near the aisle shifted uncomfortably. Another lowered his phone, no longer pretending not to watch. Emily remained still, her presence now almost centered in the tension, not shrinking from it, not feeding it either. She simply stood, calm as ever. Olivia cleared her throat. "Our first-class experience is designed for a certain level of clientele," she said, her voice quieter now, as if she was beginning to hear herself for the first time. The man's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "A certain level," he repeated softly. Then, for the first time, he let his gaze sweep across the cabin, taking in the watching faces, the unspoken judgments, the fragile assumptions that had built this moment. When he looked back at Olivia, the room seemed to hold its breath. "And you believe she does not meet that level?" he asked. This time, Olivia did not answer immediately. Her confidence, once effortless, now felt carefully assembled, piece by piece, as if one wrong word could cause it to collapse. "I am following procedure," she said finally, though the conviction behind it had begun to fade. The man studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something deeper than her words. "Of course you are," he said. There was no anger in his voice, no raised tone, but somehow that made it worse. Because in that quiet response, there was a promise, and the people watching could feel it, even if they did not yet understand it. Emily shifted slightly then, stepping forward just enough to break the stillness. She placed her boarding pass gently into the man's hand, her eyes meeting his for a brief second. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them, something that made the entire situation feel suddenly, undeniably different. The man looked down at the ticket, then back up at Olivia. And in that moment, the balance of power, invisible just seconds ago, began to tilt. The moment his eyes scanned the boarding pass, something subtle but undeniable shifted in his expression, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, the kind that does not need confirmation. He held the ticket for a second longer than necessary, then lifted his gaze back to Olivia, who now stood straighter than before, as if bracing herself against something she could not yet name. Around them, the silence had deepened into something almost tangible, like the pause before a storm that no one saw coming. "Seat 2A, he said calmly, his voice even, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation. Olivia nodded quickly, though her confidence no longer carried the same edge. "Yes, that is what the boarding pass indicates," she replied, her tone careful, each word chosen with growing awareness of the eyes surrounding her. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering something beyond the obvious. "And yet you felt the need to question it," he continued, not accusing, not raising his voice, but pressing just enough to make the weight of the moment unavoidable. Olivia hesitated again, and this time it was long enough for the discomfort to ripple through the nearby passengers. A man across the aisle shifted in his seat. A woman lowered her gaze, suddenly uninterested in watching what was unfolding. The cabin, once filled with quiet luxury, now felt like a stage where every movement mattered. "We have protocols," Olivia said finally, though the words sounded thinner now, less like authority and more like defense. The man nodded slowly, as if acknowledging her effort. "Protocols are important," he said, his tone unchanged, "but so is judgment." That word lingered. Judgment. It hung in the air, heavier than any accusation could have been. Emily stood just behind him, her presence steady, her silence louder than any argument. She did not need to speak. She did not need to prove anything. The situation was already unfolding in ways no one in that cabin had expected. Olivia swallowed, her posture tightening as she felt the balance slipping, piece by piece. "Sir, if there has been any misunderstanding, we can certainly resolve it," she said, her voice softer now, the sharpness replaced by something closer to caution. The man studied her for a moment, not with anger, but with a clarity that made excuses feel small before they were even spoken. "There is no misunderstanding," he replied. Then, slowly, deliberately, he handed the boarding pass back to Emily, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest second, a silent reassurance that did not need to be explained. When he turned back to Olivia, the cabin seemed to lean in again, drawn by something they could not quite define. "Tell me," he said, his voice still calm, still measured. "If she had been wearing a tailored suit, carrying a designer bag, would you have questioned her eligibility?" The question landed harder than any raised voice ever could. Olivia's lips parted, but no words came out. Because the answer was already there, written in the silence, reflected in the eyes of the people watching, in the subtle shift of their expressions as realization began to settle in. The man did not press further. He did not need to. He simply let the moment breathe, let it expand, let it reveal itself. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, he took a small step closer, his presence no longer just noticeable, but undeniable. "Because what you saw," he continued quietly, "was not a passenger out of place." He paused, just long enough for the words to take root. "What you saw was someone you decided did not belong." The cabin went completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the faint hum of the aircraft seemed distant now, as if the world outside had faded away. Olivia felt it then, the full weight of the moment, the realization creeping in, slow but certain, that this was no longer a simple interaction, no longer a routine enforcement of policy. Something deeper had been exposed, something that could not be undone with a polite apology or a corrected seat assignment. And as she looked at the man standing before her, truly looked this time, she began to understand that she was not in control of this situation anymore. Not even close. Olivia felt it fully now, the quiet unraveling of her certainty, the subtle shift in the room that no training manual had ever prepared her for, because this was no longer about a seat or a boarding pass. It was about something far more exposed, something that could not be corrected with a simple apology. Her hands, once steady and precise, now hovered uncertainly at her sides as she searched for the right response, the safe response, the one that would restore control. "Sir, I assure you, we treat all passengers with the utmost respect," she said, her voice carefully composed, but lacking the confidence it once carried. The man did not interrupt. He did not react immediately. Instead, he let her words settle into the silence, as if giving them space to reveal their own weakness. Then, slowly, he glanced around the cabin again, taking in the watching faces, the passengers who had witnessed every moment, every glance, every unspoken assumption. "Do you?" he asked quietly. It was not a challenge. It was something far more unsettling. A reflection. Olivia's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words hesitated, caught somewhere between intention and truth. Because in that moment, surrounded by the stillness of the cabin and the weight of every eye upon her, she could hear it too, the difference between what was said and what had actually happened. Emily remained silent, her posture unchanged, her presence now impossible to ignore. There was no anger in her. Expression, no visible frustration, only a quiet dignity that made the entire situation feel even more exposed. She had not demanded respect. She had simply carried it with her. And that, more than anything, made the contrast undeniable. The man took a small breath, not out of impatience, but as if deciding something. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm, but there was a finality to it now, something that signaled the moment was no longer unfolding, it was arriving. "What is your name?" he asked. The question landed gently, but its impact was immediate. Olivia blinked, caught off guard by its simplicity. "Olivia Hayes," she replied, almost automatically. He nodded once, acknowledging the answer as if committing it to memory. Then, without raising his voice, without shifting his tone, he asked the question that changed everything. "How long have you worked for this airline, Olivia?" The use of her name made it personal. Not confrontational, but precise. Olivia straightened slightly, instinctively reverting to form. 5 years, she said. 5 years, he repeated softly, as if weighing the number. That is enough time to understand what this company stands for. The words were not loud, but they carried through the cabin with unmistakable clarity. A few passengers exchanged glances. A man near the window leaned forward slightly, sensing something deeper beneath the surface. Olivia felt it too, the shift from a simple interaction to something far more consequential. "Yes, sir," she said, though her voice now held a trace of uncertainty. The man studied her for a moment longer, then nodded again, slower this time. "Then you should know that we do not measure our passengers by appearance," he said. The statement was calm, but it landed with weight. "We do not decide who belongs based on clothing, or assumptions, or convenience." Each word seemed to settle into the room, filling the space where confidence had once stood. Olivia's expression faltered, just slightly, but it was enough. Because now, the gap between what she had done and what she was supposed to represent had become impossible to ignore. The man did not raise his voice. He did not accuse her directly. He simply allowed the truth to stand on its own. And in that silence, it was louder than anything else. Emily finally moved then, stepping forward with the same quiet grace she had carried from the beginning. She did not look at Olivia. She did not need to. Instead, she turned slightly toward her seat, as if the situation had already resolved itself in her mind. But before she could take another step, the man spoke again, his voice softer now, but somehow even more powerful. "And you should also know," he said, pausing just long enough for every person in that cabin to feel the weight of what was coming next, "that the standards you represent reflect directly on the people who built this airline." The words hung there, suspended in the silence, unfinished, but heavy with implication. Olivia's breath caught slightly, her mind racing to understand what she had just heard, to connect the pieces that no longer felt separate. And in that moment, as she looked at the man standing before her, really looked this time, something shifted in her expression, something that had nothing to do with protocol or procedure. It was recognition, slow and dawning, like a light turning on in a room she had thought she understood. The cabin remained still. No one moved. No one spoke. Because everyone could feel it now. The moment before everything changed. Recognition did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, piece by piece, as Olivia's eyes lingered on his face, searching her memory for something she could not yet fully grasp, but could no longer ignore. The tailored suit, the composed posture, the way the room itself seemed to shift around him. It was not just presence, it was familiarity, the kind that belonged in training videos, corporate briefings, framed photographs in back offices that most employees walked past without ever expecting to meet in person. Her breath slowed, then caught again as the realization began to form, incomplete but undeniable. "Sir," she started, but the word felt different now, heavier, uncertain. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched her, not with impatience, but with a calm that allowed the truth to arrive on its own. Around them, the cabin remained still, the silence no longer tense, but anticipatory, as if everyone present understood that they were standing at the edge of something irreversible. A flight attendant from further down the aisle had stopped mid-step, her expression frozen between curiosity and concern. A passenger near the window subtly leaned forward, no longer pretending not to listen. Emily stood just behind him, her presence steady, her composure unchanged. But now there was something else, something quietly revealed, not through words, but through the way the moment had begun to bend around her. Olivia swallowed, her voice lowering instinctively. "I did not realize," she said, though the sentence never finished. Because realization was no longer something she could control. It was happening in real time, unfolding in front of everyone. The man finally spoke, his tone unchanged, still calm, still measured, but now carrying a quiet finality that settled into the room like a closing door. "No," he said gently, "you did not." There was no accusation in his voice, and somehow that made the weight of it even heavier. He was not correcting her. He was confirming the truth she had already exposed. Olivia's hands tightened slightly at her sides, her posture no longer firm, but carefully held together, as if one wrong movement might cause everything to slip further. "I was following procedure," she repeated, though this time the words felt smaller, almost distant, like something she was trying to convince herself of rather than anyone else. The man nodded once more, acknowledging her statement without challenging it directly. "And procedure matters," he said, "but it is never meant to replace judgment." The sentence landed softly, but its meaning echoed. Around them, the watching passengers felt it too, the shift from authority to accountability, from control to consequence. Emily took a quiet step forward then, her movement subtle, but enough to draw attention back to her. She reached for her boarding pass, now still in the man's hand, and he returned it without hesitation, their exchange silent but complete. For a brief second, their eyes met, and in that moment, everything that needed to be understood was understood. Olivia saw it. She saw the connection, the unspoken familiarity, the ease between them that could not be explained by coincidence. And that was when it finally settled, fully, undeniably. Her gaze shifted back to the man, her expression no longer searching, no longer uncertain. It was clear now. The realization had arrived. Her voice, when it came again, was quieter than before. "Mr. Carter," she said, almost under her breath, as if speaking it too loudly might make it more real than she was ready to accept. The name moved through the cabin like a ripple, subtle at first, then spreading, connecting. With recognition in places she could not see. A man in the second row straightened abruptly. Another passenger exchanged a glance with his companion, whispering something that did not need to be heard to be understood. The man, Daniel Carter, did not react to the name. He did not confirm it. He did not deny it. He simply stood there, composed as ever, as if the truth did not need to be announced because it was already evident. Olivia's composure faltered for the first time, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for the shift to be visible. Enough for the moment to complete itself. "I apologize," she said quickly, the words arriving faster now, driven by urgency rather than confidence. "There has clearly been a misunderstanding. Your wife's seat is, of course, confirmed. Please allow me to assist." The offer came with a gesture, polite, practiced, but now entirely different from the one that had started this interaction. It was no longer about control. It was about correction. Daniel did not move. He did not immediately accept. Instead, he looked at her for a moment longer, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a clarity that left no space for pretense. "You already had the opportunity to assist," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they settled into the room with undeniable weight. The cabin went completely still. And in that stillness, Olivia understood something she had not considered before, something far more lasting than the outcome of this moment. This was not about a seat. It never had been. The weight of his words did not need volume to carry authority. It settled into the cabin with a quiet finality that made every movement feel deliberate, every breath measured. Olivia felt it in the way her shoulders no longer held the same certainty, in the way her practiced smile had completely disappeared, replaced by something far more human, far more uncertain. Around her, the world she had controlled just moments ago had shifted into something unfamiliar, something where every assumption was now being examined under a silent, unyielding light. Daniel Carter did not raise his voice, did not demand attention, and yet the entire cabin remained fixed on him, as if instinctively aware that this moment carried more than just a correction, it carried a lesson. Emily stood beside him now, no longer behind, her presence aligned with his, not in dominance, but in quiet balance, as if they had always occupied the same space, even when others failed to see it. Olivia took a small breath, steadying herself, her voice softer than before, stripped of performance. "I understand," she said, though it was clear she was only beginning to. Daniel regarded her for a moment, not with judgment, but with clarity, the kind that left no room for misunderstanding. "Do you?" he asked gently. The question was not meant to trap her, but to invite something deeper, something beyond protocol, beyond rehearsed responses. Olivia hesitated, then nodded, though this time the gesture was slower, more thoughtful. "I believe I do," she replied, and for the first time, it sounded sincere. The cabin remained still, but the tension had shifted, no longer sharp, but reflective, as if everyone present was quietly reconsidering what they had witnessed. Daniel glanced briefly at Emily, and there was something in that look, something that softened the edges of the moment, reminding anyone paying attention that this was not about power for its own sake. It was about something more grounded, more enduring. When he turned back to Olivia, his voice remained calm, but there was a quiet decision behind it now. "Then let us make sure this does not happen again," he said. It was not a threat. It was not a command. It was a standard. Olivia nodded quickly, but not out of fear, out of understanding. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steadying as she accepted what the moment required of her. A supervisor, who had been standing just a few steps away, stepped forward cautiously, having recognized Daniel much earlier, but choosing not to interrupt. His posture was respectful, careful. "Mr. Carter, we can ensure that Mrs. Carter is seated immediately," he offered, his tone professional, but noticeably deferential. Daniel acknowledged him with a slight nod, but his attention remained on Olivia. "I have no doubt you can," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "But seating is not the issue." The words settled again, reinforcing what had already been made clear. Emily finally moved fully into the aisle, stepping toward her seat with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning. No rush, no hesitation, just certainty. As she passed Olivia, their eyes met for the briefest moment. There was no anger there, no resentment, only a calm acknowledgement, as if to say that the moment had already said everything that needed to be said. Olivia lowered her gaze slightly, not out of submission, but out of reflection, understanding now that respect was not something granted by position, but revealed through action. Emily reached seat 2A and placed her bag gently in the overhead compartment, her movements unhurried, unaffected by the attention that still lingered in the cabin. Daniel remained where he stood for a second longer, allowing the moment to settle fully, ensuring that nothing about it would be forgotten or dismissed as routine. Then, finally, he stepped forward, taking the seat beside her without ceremony, as if this, and not the confrontation, was the only part that truly mattered. The cabin slowly began to breathe again. Conversations resumed, though quieter now, more thoughtful. Passengers shifted in their seats, some glancing toward Emily, no longer with judgment, but with a new awareness. Olivia remained in place for a moment longer, collecting herself, not as an employee correcting a mistake, but as a person recognizing one. And in that quiet realization, something lasting had already begun to change. The plane had not yet taken off, but in that cabin, something far more important already had. The aircraft doors closed with a soft, final click, sealing the cabin in a quiet that felt different now, heavier with awareness than anticipation, as if everyone on board understood that something more than a routine boarding had just taken place. The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the engines began their low, steady hum, a sound that usually faded into the background, but now seemed to underline the silence that lingered between rows of passengers who had all witnessed the same moment, yet were each processing it in their own way. Emily sat comfortably in her seat, her posture relaxed, her gaze directed calmly out the window as the runway lights stretched into the distance. There was no trace of tension in her expression, no sign that anything unusual had happened, as if the entire situation had already been placed behind her, filed away as something not worth carrying forward. Beside her, Daniel adjusted his seatbelt with quiet precision, his movements unhurried, controlled, the same calm presence that had shifted the entire cabin just minutes earlier now settling back into something almost invisible. Across the aisle, a passenger who had earlier watched with thinly veiled curiosity now avoided looking in their direction, instead focusing intently on his phone, though the screen remained unchanged. A woman 2 rows ahead glanced back briefly, her expression thoughtful, as if reconsidering a judgment she had not even realized she made. The atmosphere had not returned to normal. It had evolved into something quieter, more reflective, like a room after an important conversation that no one would openly discuss, but no one could forget. Near the front galley, Olivia stood still for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly against the service counter as she exhaled slowly, grounding herself in the reality of what had just occurred. Her reflection in the polished surface stared back at her, composed, professional, but no longer untouched. She had replayed the moment in her mind already, the glance, the tone, the assumption, each piece now clearer than it had been in the moment it happened. And for the first time in her 5 years working in that uniform, she was not thinking about procedure or timing or service standards. She was thinking about judgment. The supervisor approached her quietly, his voice low enough to remain private. "Are you all right?" he asked. Olivia nodded, though the gesture carried more thought than certainty. "Yes," she replied, then paused before adding, "I will be." It was not a dismissal. It was a recognition that something had shifted, something she would not ignore. The supervisor gave a small nod, understanding more than she said, and stepped away without further comment. Back in the cabin, a flight attendant began the routine pre-departure announcements, her voice smooth and practiced, guiding passengers through safety instructions that now felt almost distant compared to the silence that had come before. Emily listened quietly, her attention steady, her presence unchanged, as if she had never needed the moment to prove anything in the first place. Daniel glanced at her briefly, a faint smile touching his expression, not one of triumph, but of quiet appreciation, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them. She returned the look with the slightest nod, a shared understanding that required no explanation. The plane began to taxi slowly, the gentle movement pulling the cabin forward, carrying everyone along the same path regardless of where they had started. Olivia stepped back into the aisle then, her posture straight again, but different now, not driven by routine, but by awareness. As she moved down the cabin, her interactions shifted, subtle but real, her tone softer, her attention more deliberate, as if she was seeing each passenger with clearer eyes than before. When she reached Emily's row, she paused briefly, not to speak, not to interrupt, but simply to acknowledge, a quiet moment of recognition that passed without words. Emily met her gaze for a second, calm as ever, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. The engines grew louder as the plane aligned with the runway, the cabin vibrating slightly as momentum built. Outside, the lights blurred into long streaks, the ground preparing to fall away beneath them. Inside, the silence returned one last time, not heavy, not tense, but settled, like a lesson that had found its place. And as the aircraft lifted into the sky, carrying everyone forward, one truth remained quietly anchored in that first-class cabin, something no altitude could change, no distance could erase. Respect had never been about where you sit. It had always been about how you see. At 30,000 feet, the cabin settled into a rhythm of quiet movement and soft murmurs. The earlier tension now dissolved into something more reflective, more lasting than any announcement could carry, as if the lesson had followed them into the sky. The seatbelt sign remained on, a soft chime echoing through the cabin as passengers adjusted in their seats. But the energy had changed, not outwardly dramatic, yet unmistakably different. Emily sat by the window, her gaze resting on the endless stretch of clouds below, calm and unbothered, as though nothing about the earlier moment had altered her sense of self. She did not seek validation, did not look around to see who was watching now, because she had never needed their approval to begin with. Beside her, Daniel leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, his attention momentarily on the tablet in his hands, though his awareness never fully left the space around him. Across the aisle, a man who had earlier questioned her presence now sat quietly, his posture more reserved, his earlier confidence replaced with a subtle humility that had not been there before. Further down the cabin, conversations resumed, but softer, more measured, as if each word now carried a trace of thoughtfulness that had not existed before boarding. Near the galley, Olivia moved with a renewed sense of intention, her steps steady but no longer automatic, each interaction deliberate, each glance more attentive, as if she was relearning something she had once believed she already understood. She approached a passenger with a gentle smile, offering assistance without assumption, her tone respectful without effort, and for the first time, it felt genuine in a way that routine had never required. The transformation was quiet, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but it was there, shaped by a moment she would not forget. When she reached Emily's row again, she paused, this time with a small service tray in hand. "Would you care for something to drink?" she asked, her voice calm, steady, and free of the sharp edge it once carried. Emily turned her head slightly, meeting her eyes with the same composed expression. "Water, please," she said simply. Olivia nodded, her movements careful, almost respectful, as she handed over the glass. Their fingers did not touch, but the exchange carried something more than service, something unspoken yet understood. "Thank you," Emily added softly, and for a brief second, Olivia hesitated, as if the words meant more than they should. "You are welcome," she replied, her voice quieter now, but sincere. As she stepped away, she exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of recognition, as if she had crossed an invisible line within herself. Back in their seats, Daniel glanced toward Emily, a subtle question in his eyes, one that did not need words. Emily gave a faint smile, almost imperceptible, but enough. There was no need to revisit what had happened, no need to discuss it or analyze it. The moment had already served its purpose. A few rows behind them, a young passenger leaned toward his companion and whispered something, but the tone was no longer dismissive or curious. It was reflective, as if he had witnessed something worth remembering. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight settled into cruising altitude, the outside world reduced to a quiet expanse of sky and light. Inside, the earlier silence returned once more, but this time it carried no tension, only understanding. And as the plane continued its steady path forward, one thing had become clear to everyone who had watched that moment unfold, something that could not be unlearned or ignored. The way you see someone says far more about you than it ever will about them. And up there, above the noise of the world, that truth felt impossible to deny. By the time the aircraft began its gradual descent, the cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost reflective, as if the journey had carried more than just passengers across miles of sky, but something less visible, something that lingered beneath the surface of every interaction. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady, announcing their arrival time and weather conditions, but even that familiar sound seemed softer against the weight of what had unfolded earlier. Emily remained by the window, watching the clouds give way to the distant outline of the city below, her expression unchanged, grounded, as though nothing about her sense of self had ever depended on where she sat or how others saw her. Beside her, Daniel adjusted his cuff slightly, his gaze thoughtful, not focused on the events themselves, but on their meaning, as if he understood that moments like these were not isolated, but reflections of something larger. Across the cabin, the atmosphere remained subtly different, not tense, not uneasy, but aware. A businessman who had earlier observed the confrontation now folded his newspaper slowly, his eyes lingering for a moment longer than before, not out of curiosity, but contemplation. A woman near the aisle straightened her posture as a flight attendant approached, her tone noticeably warmer, more respectful, as if something unspoken had shifted in how she chose to engage. And near the front, Olivia stood once more by the galley, her reflection faintly visible in the polished metal surface beside her. She had moved through the remainder of the flight with quiet precision, but it was no longer just routine guiding her actions. There was intention now, awareness in every glance, every word, every pause. She replayed the moment again, not out of regret alone, but out of understanding, recognizing how quickly assumption had taken the place of observation, how easily she had mistaken appearance for truth. When she finally stepped forward again, it was not with hesitation, but with clarity. She approached Emily and Daniel's row one last time, not carrying a tray or offering a service, but simply standing there for a brief moment, waiting until Emily turned toward her. "Mrs. Carter," she said softly, her voice steady but sincere, "I want to apologize again, properly this time." The words were simple, but they held none of the urgency from before, no attempt to correct a mistake in the moment, only a genuine acknowledgement of it. Emily looked at her for a second, her gaze calm, thoughtful, as if weighing not the words, but the intention behind them. Then she gave a small nod, her voice quiet but clear. "Thank you," she said. "Nothing more. No lecture. No reminder. Just acceptance." And somehow, that made the moment complete. Olivia nodded in return, her posture easing slightly, not because the situation had been fixed, but because it had been understood. As she stepped away, there was no lingering discomfort, only a quiet resolve, a decision carried forward into whatever came next. The plane descended smoothly, the city now fully visible beneath them, streets and buildings stretching outward in careful patterns, each life below carrying its own stories, its own unseen truths. Inside the cabin, passengers prepared for landing, seatbacks upright, trays secured, conversations returning in low tones, but the awareness remained, subtle yet present, woven into the quiet space between them. Daniel glanced once more at Emily, a faint smile touching his expression, not one of victory, but of quiet respect, the kind that did not need to be proven. Emily returned her attention to the window, the reflection of the cabin faintly visible in the glass, a reminder that what people see is often only a surface, never the full story. As the wheels touched down, a gentle jolt running through the cabin, the moment passed into memory, but its meaning did not fade. Because somewhere between takeoff and landing, something had shifted, not just in one person, but in everyone who had witnessed it. And long after the plane reached the gate and the passengers stepped back into their separate lives, one truth remained, quiet but undeniable. The way you treat someone when you think they have nothing to offer reveals everything about who you are. And that day, at 30,000 feet, dignity did not need to be announced. It was simply seen.